Good morning and welcome to our 2025 virtual SQE conference. Thanks for joining us. In case you don't know me, I'm Julie Swan. I'm Director of Education and Training at the SRA, and I'll be chairing the first two sessions of today's conference. If you've looked at the programme, you'll know there are 3 sessions in total, 2 this morning and 1 this afternoon. Both of the morning sessions will focus on the SQE, and in the afternoon we'll turn to Qualifying Work Experience, QWE. It'll be great if you can join us for all of them, but of course that's entirely up to you. If you have to leave, you will be able to catch up on YouTube or on our on-demand page. We'll also publish the slides on that page too, so no need to take lots of notes, and we'll email a link to you afterwards. Of course, one of the benefits of joining in real time is that you'll be able to ask questions. If you have a question, you can submit it using the link in the description below, and we'll answer as many as we can at the end of the session. We've also got a feedback form. It would be great if you could please take the time to fill it in, because that helps us plan future events. So during this morning session, we're going to hear from Ricardo Lee, the SQE's Independent Reviewer. We're then going to hear from Zoe Robinson, Kaplan's Managing Director, and Zoe Robinson, Kaplan's Managing Director, and Tim Madison, Kaplan's Legal Academic Director. They're going to look at the SQE in its 3rd full year of delivery, and Tim's going to do a deep dive on SQE1 standard setting. The Independent Reviewer's annual report and Kaplan's annual report, both of which cover the academic year 2023-24, were published in March. So if you want to look at more detail now or later, you can go and find those reports published in full. So that's the first of the sessions. In the second of this morning's sessions, we're going to look in more detail about how the SQE works, with a focus on information for candidates. Before I hand over to Ricardo, just a few reflections on me on the last year. It's been a full year, some ups, some downs. Let's deal with the downs first. Obviously, the fact that 175 candidates who took SQE1 in January 2024 had wrongly been told they'd failed one or both parts of the assessment was the greatest down. How this came about and how it was dealt with is covered in the published reports, but we will pick this up later this morning. The other disappointment was our inability, the SRA's inability, to publish useful data linking how candidates performed in the assessments with how they told us they prepared for those assessments. We were gearing up to publish last autumn, but final quality checks on the data highlighted some problems that we simply hadn't foreseen. There was a risk if we published that the data would be misleading and it wouldn't serve its purpose of informing candidates or supporting the development of a healthy training market. So we took the difficult decision to press pause. We remain committed to publishing data. We know candidates want it. We've addressed the issues that we found in the way the data is collected, but it will take some time to wash through, and we're going to need the data from July's SQE1 before we will have sufficient data to publish. But turning to the highs, for me, Kaplan's overhaul of the booking arrangements was a big triumph. We know that candidates hadn't enjoyed the original arrangements, and we'll hear more about the changes on that later. I was pleased that the growing number of candidates, we had over 14,000 individual candidates who took at least one assessment in 2023, were accommodated. The continuing success of the solicitor apprenticeship route to qualification continues to be so pleasing to see, both in terms of the growing numbers of individuals choosing to qualify in that way and the performance of solicitor apprentices in the SQE exams. And I'd also like to mention the training market. There's such a wide range of choices for candidates, with a wide range of delivery options at an equally wide range of prices. It's interesting to see how candidates are taking up. I know from dipping into social media from time to time that they're informing each other about the options, what they like, what doesn't work, giving each other tips, and that's good to see. So just briefly looking forward, in line with our published framework, phase 3 of our evaluation is underway. This is being undertaken by the independent research consultancy IFF. Thank you to everyone who's contributed. The researchers are working through a large volume of quantitative and qualitative data, and will be reporting on the findings in the autumn. Last summer, we published the final report of the research we commissioned from the University of Exeter into the potential causes of differential outcomes in legal professional assessments by ethnicity. We held a summit on the findings last October, and we're now working with others on a set of actions to identify the cause, to address the causes identified, at least to address the causes that are within our sphere of influence. In this context, we're convening a forum that will meet 6 times a year to share progress, hear about initiatives, learn from other sectors, and disseminate research. And this is very much in line with one of the suggestions in the research report. These forums will be virtual. The first one is taking place on 9th of April. We've got a lot of people already signed up. But if you are interested in joining these forums, please email us using the address diversity@sra.org.uk. Finally, in terms of looking forward, we've invited organisations that already run schemes supporting aspiring solicitors to qualify to apply to us for a share of funding from the Access and Reinvestment Fund. The funding will cover SQE entry fees for a number of candidates. So just to reiterate, we're inviting organisations running schemes rather than individual candidates who want to benefit to apply to us, and the closing date is the 30th of April. More information is on our website. So that's a brief look back and forward from me. I'm now going to invite Ricardo Lay, the SQE Independent Reviewer, to join us and to share his reflections on the year. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Julie, and good morning, everyone. So I'm Ricardo Lay, as Julie mentioned, the Independent Reviewer. I just thought I would start off by giving a brief introduction to my role and what its purpose is really. So the Independent Reviewer role is meant to provide external assurance to the SRA and to their exam services provider, Kaplan, that the SQE is fair, defensible, and will command public respect. I've been in the role since January 2024. So comments today will be based on observations, I guess, over the past year and a bit, and full details are available in my report that was published last month. When I started in the role last year, I think it's important to acknowledge the work of my predecessor, the previous independent reviewer, who was in post for the 5 years previous to January 2024, who really saw the SQE through its design stages and the first few deliveries. And upon handover, he highlighted some key points from my observations over the past year, so things that I focused on while I was also trying to familiarize myself with the assessment as a whole. So how do I do this? What have I done over the past year to come to my conclusions and recommendations? So my evidence was gathered through a mixture of various key activities, including direct observation of the various processes that go into exam development, creation, and delivery. Interviews with key staff, both at the SRA and at Kaplan. Being provided access to reports and information that are produced and published by the SRA and Kaplan, some support and advice from the independent psychometrician, and being invited to observe key meetings, including assessment boards and meetings that feed into these assessment board preparations and ongoing quality assurance. So I'd like to acknowledge and thank those who've taken the time to both invite me to observe these processes or have one-on-one conversations with me. So I come to my conclusions and make recommendations. I'm guided by my judgment as someone who has a background in assessment, applying what I've observed over the past year in my role alongside my assessment knowledge from other similar high stakes qualifications. And I think the guiding principle that I constantly think of is to balance the best interests of candidates taking the exams with those who rely on the outcomes of these exams, such as employers and the general public, to make robust decisions about candidates' competence. So looking at, I guess, the assessment as a whole, a crucial aspect to validity is that the assessments, really measure the appropriate knowledge and skills that a day one solicitor is required to have. So you want an appropriate mix of reliability and validity, and we do see that across, I guess, the various aspects of the assessment that are delivered, from the single best answer multiple choice questions in SQE1 to the mix of written and live observed stations in SQE2. And I think this diversity of assessment type is really a strength of the assessment. But on the flip side, it does also make it somewhat complex and technically demanding to both create and deliver, especially given their high stakes nature. So to delve into this a little bit more, I'm going to talk about a few key areas of my report. So the first point I'd like to touch on are the SQE2 oral exams. So these are delivered at test centres across England and Wales, and the delivery of these is fully managed by Kaplan. These oral assessments are logistically complex, requiring the assessor and candidate to be face-to-face in a space that's under appropriate exam conditions with quarantining in place to ensure that multiple sessions can be delivered across the day without any contamination of exam content. So over the past year, I visited three of these oral venues and spoke to Kaplan and SRA staff present and received their feedback, and also discussed other locations that I wasn't able to physically get to over the past year. At a high-level summary, I really think all of these venues are of an extremely high caliber. Some of them are purpose-built for delivering in-person skills-based assessments to meet the needs of these SQE2 oral exams. And those venues that are intended for more generic purposes do undergo quite an extensive setup process to ensure that the a secure, efficient, and professional environment is available for delivery of these exams. So I think this really is the gold standard from my experience in other areas, both in higher education and other professional exams. I think colleagues would be, quite jealous of this setup because it really provides exactly what, the SQE2 orals need. Further observations from the oral exams, show that they're well staffed and ensure that the assessment does run smoothly, and more importantly, that adequate calibration occurs at each venue. So I think we can have assurance that regardless of which location a candidate has taken this venue at, that the same experience applies and that consistent standard in the marking process is there. The next point I'd like to touch on is the function of spell check. So this was one of the key points that was highlighted in the previous independent reviewer report, and he asked me to explore this further when I took over the role. And in summary, I think the absence of a spell check function was highlighted. And without this function, the validity of the SQE2 exams is somewhat hindered, as they do not fully replicate the context in which a day one solicitor would operate, under the assumption that a day one solicitor would have access to these types of functions. So at the time of writing, I'm assured that this does remain a priority of Kaplan to look into over the next year. I understand that there is a very clear action plan in place. And in my next update, I do hope to provide further information on the development of this, hopefully in the near future. One other point that I'd like to touch on, which Julie already mentioned, was the candidate services process. Kaplan has a very excellent approach to obtaining candidate feedback. But one of the points I took on when I first started in this role was to look into some concerns from a minority of candidates that reported that the booking process, was I guess less than ideal. And this was mainly relating to the increase in volume of SQE candidates. And there were some candidates that I guess reported a stressful experience in booking on a seat. However, over the past year, I have been updated on the enhancements to the booking process and a slight change as to how registration now happens. And quantitative feedback really shows a marked increase in satisfaction with the booking process. And I've been in some candidate focus groups where they have really praised these changes. And if there are any further challenges that are encountered, the Kaplan team really does provide appropriate solutions to address them as quickly and efficiently as possible. I'd also like to touch a little bit on the SQE offering in Welsh. So there wasn't much that I observed on this year. I understand a lot of the work and preparations for this happened prior to my appointment in January 2024. So from what I understand and observe is that the assessment is ready to be delivered in Welsh, but I did not directly observe any of this because no candidate has requested it during the past year. I do understand that there is potentially some interest of candidates taking it in the near future, so I do look forward to observing this process and reporting back on it. However, one of the, I guess, to my understanding, one of the reasons why there has been a lack of uptake is that, from speaking to key staff members, I understand there are currently no training providers that offer full SQE preparation in Welsh. And I believe that this was fed back directly from some prospective candidates as to being a contributing factor as to why there have been no requests to sit the SQE in Welsh to date. So I do hope that there may be some demand in the near future. I'm able to observe this process and then report back on how things are progressing. So when I came on board at the beginning of last year, I obviously understood that the SQE exam was sort of up and running, and I asked the question of, are we in this business as usual phase now that we've run it for a few years? And I think the short answer to that is no, which in a way is quite reassuring because I have observed quite good dedication to the ongoing quality assurance of the assessment over time, despite the fact that we are up and running now for several years. One key point that I'd really like to commend is a new process this year that consists of meetings that are dedicated to exploring issues not related to any particular SQE sitting or its associated results, which are the main purpose of the assessment board, which is outlined in the regulations. But this process looks at the assessment over time to look at any potential overarching issues and give some dedicated thinking time and space to the continued development of this assessment. I think this will really ensure that future developments are proactive and considered in light of assessment best practice and educational theory, rather than just being reactive to any particular issues that may arise from individual sittings. So I think this is very positive to see. I understand that the SQE is quite a unique assessment in the field of solicitor qualification, potentially in the wider legal education sphere. So sometimes there isn't always precedent when difficult decisions need to be made or new processes need to be developed. But I've been reassured by seeing that Kaplan is very open to using external expertise, and I've witnessed this at several points throughout the year. And I really would encourage this, to continue to get in external input from other fields that run similar high-stakes assessments, such as those in potentially medical education or in the wider education academic field. And I think this really highlights a culture that is consistently looking to improve and remain at the forefront of professional exams. And so the final point I'd like to raise isn't specifically covered in my report, but I think it's something I'll be looking towards over the next year. And this is on the topic of assessment literacy. So assessment literacy really deals with the knowledge of the assessment process rather than the content itself that's being assessed. And I think this is quite important for candidates and training providers to really be familiar with the technical approaches to the assessment, understanding the nature, the meaning, and level of the assessment criteria and standards. Throughout some of my observations this year, I've seen both in some formal feedback sessions and in some informal conversations I've had there to be a little bit of a lack of this. I've seen some potential comments about, candidates being unsure of the standard, but also unsure of the exact process, why things are in place. Some examples of this may be, querying why there are strict rules around items permitted in assessments, or why is there sequestering large waiting times between when I'm able to start my assessment. While I understand, these may not be, the best for the candidate experience, they're very common in high stakes assessment. If we look elsewhere, these rules really exist in other places, and they're really in place to ensure the validity of outcomes so that candidates have very similar experiences and that we can really extrapolate the outcomes of the assessment being related to the candidate's knowledge themselves rather than any other external factors impacting on, the assessment itself. I think all of these, aspects of the assessment are very clearly detailed in the SQE assessment regulations. So I think it's just a matter of ensuring that candidates understand these better when they approach the assessment so that they know what to expect and the reasons why these processes are in place. I do understand that there is an action plan in place to both help candidates further familiarize themselves with the assessments, but also to help support training providers in providing, writing good SBA MCQs in the style used in SQE1 to help familiarize candidates with that process before they approach the assessment. So that sort of summarizes, some key points that I've reported in my annual report. So I really do look forward to speaking with you at this point next year and providing an update on some of these areas of work that I have mentioned. But in the meantime, in summary, I'd just like to highlight that I really do see clear evidence to form my opinion that the SQE outcomes continue to be fair, defensible, and reliable. So thank you. That's it from me, and I'll now hand back to Julie.
Thank you, Ricardo. And a reminder that you can read Ricardo's report on our website, together with the reports of his predecessors, which Ricardo mentioned. So thank you for that. Okay, so we're now going to move on to Kaplan's annual report, and I'm going to invite Zoe Robinson, Managing Director of Kaplan Assessment, to join me. And Zoe, perhaps you can kick off by telling us about how the last year has felt to you.
Yeah, of course. Thanks, Julie, and hello to everybody. Thanks for joining us this morning. So at headline level, I think things are going pretty well. As was the case last year, the annual report contains previously unpublished statistics regarding test reliability, which has consistently been well above the widely accepted gold standard measures for high stakes assessments. As the assessment provider, delivering fair and reliable assessments is arguably our main objective. So we're really pleased with those outcomes. I'd definitely echo your comments, Julie, about highs and lows, and the notable exception is obviously the issue you mentioned earlier relating to the January 24 SQE1 results release. And I'd like to come back on that in a bit more detail later on, perhaps. But we are generally pleased. Great to hear both you and Ricardo mention the improving feedback from candidates. All exams delivered in the period were covered by the report, and more recently have been operationally smooth. We've seen some great improvements on some of the earlier assessments, particularly around the booking journey. So these are some of the quotes that we've had from candidate feedback forms over the two most recent sittings. And I think they really reflect the move to a more positive sentiment that we've seen from candidates recently. We're very mindful that delivering high stakes, challenging assessments, we want to ensure that candidates have an experience that allows them to perform their best. So when we see comments such as well organised, professional staff, well-structured, thorough assessment, it really is music to our ears. Section 9 of the annual report does have a summary of the post-assessment candidate survey feedback. It flags areas that we do continue to look at. We're not saying we've got everything perfect now. We're not resting on our laurels, that's for sure. So, you know, the booking process for candidates with reasonable adjustments, that's definitely an area that we're continuing to focus on, and we'll touch a little bit on that later on as well. But the fact that the satisfaction with the booking process overall has increased, reflecting that the positive impact that the changes we've made is great. Satisfaction with the guidance about the assessment also increased, and quite significantly for SQE1. And satisfaction with the oral centres, that remains strong. But importantly, the administration at the Pearson View centres, so for SQE1 and SQE2 written test centres, that went from being the weakest performing area in 22-23 to the strongest area after SQE1 in July 24. So, yeah, really great improvements, but we're going to continue to work on areas where we think we could do more.
Thanks, Zoe. So should we dig down a bit into the assessment performance first and then return to the January 2024 SQE1 results issue? And how about starting with SQE1?
Yeah, great idea. Okay, so just over 11,000 candidates took one or more of the FLK1 or FLK2 assessments across the two sittings that we had last year in January and July. Now that compares to just over 6,500 in the previous year, so an increase of just over 70%. Now, whilst that's a huge increase in numbers, the move we made to week-long assessment windows in January 24 for each of FLK1 and FLK2, that has meant that we've been able to accommodate those increases. It's also helped us to reduce the impact of any issues that candidates might experience on the day. So whilst these are rare, unfortunately, they do arise occasionally. It's just the nature of computer-based exams, I'm afraid. And this new window approach makes it much easier for us to quickly reschedule exams for candidates if technical issues do arise. So that really helps to limit the disruption that they face, and importantly means that in the majority of situations, the vast majority of situations, candidates are able to stay on track with the same sort of timelines that they were intending on when they're going to sit the exam. We've also had the January 25 SQE1 sitting, and we published the post-assessment report for that yesterday. So we had just over 7,500 candidates that sat in that sitting across over 200 test centres in the UK and overseas. We're expecting a similar number to sit this July as well.
Thanks, Zoe. So you've mentioned the increasing number. We've moved to a week for FLK1 and a week for FLK2. We've had questions in the past about whether it's going to be necessary to extend that window so that you're testing over a longer period. What's your thoughts on that at the moment?
I think that's a really good point to pick up, because we know that that things like that can really affect candidates' planning and training providers and employers as well. So at this stage, we do not think that there's going to be a need to increase the length of those assessment windows, certainly not in 2025, and we're not anticipating it in 26 or even 27 either. We will keep it under review, of course, making sure there's sufficient seats for candidates to be able to sit the exams is the priority. But as we stand at the moment, there's no intention of increasing. But if anything does come up, we'll let stakeholders know as soon as possible.
Thanks, Zoe. So should we look at pass rates for SQE1? In particular, let's have a look at the lower pass rate for the July 2024 sitting. We know this did attract some comment and raise some questions. So if you could look at pass rates overall, but focus on that in particular.
Yeah, of course. And I think this goes to Ricardo's point that he made about assessment literacy in a way. So just to sort of remind everybody here, there is no predetermined pass rate or pass mark for any SQE assessment. As we've mentioned before, the pass mark is set independently for each paper to allow for any slight differences in the sort of difficulty of the exam. So one exam paper might be a little bit harder or a little bit easier than others, even though we try, our intention is to make them equally challenging, but you can't ever be absolutely precise on that. And that's why we have the mechanism for setting the pass mark that we do, to ensure that it is absolutely fair for candidates, and that any small variations that there may be, where we see evidence that one paper might be, say, slightly harder than others, a slightly lower pass mark would therefore be set for that paper. So to put it frankly, if a candidate meets the standard set by that pass mark, they will pass. And to absolutely dispel a myth that I know that is around. In fact, I've read an article on this week in one of the sort of the sort of the media outlets there, and they were wrong. It's actually quite unhelpful when this happens. There is no quota or limit on who can pass the exam. It doesn't depend on who else is sitting the exam in that particular window. Theoretically, if every candidate met the standard, they'd all pass, and the pass rate would be 100%. Okay, so I think that's really important that people understand that. So to go back to your question, there was a difference in pass rates between the two sittings in 2024, and that was quite large. So the July 24 pass rate was the lowest pass rate that we'd seen to date. But all of our standard setting processes and our quality assurance processes assured us that those outcomes were correct outcomes. We're confident that that cohort unfortunately just performed less well, and it wasn't that the assessment pass mark was too high. So we can see on the slide, I've also put on there the January 25 SQE1 pass rates. Those results were released to candidates on the 11th of March. And as I mentioned, the statistical report was published yesterday. And that's got full information, as usual, on all of the pass rates and the performance of the assessment. So the overall pass rate was 56%, in line with what we saw in January 24. Of course, it's going to remain to be seen what happens in July 25 and whether we see a similar drop in the pass rates there. It wouldn't surprise me. This sort of trend is actually quite common in similar other professional exams that have sort of 2 assessment windows like that. But who knows? It's obviously very early days in the SQE journey. Just to flag to people, I know you mentioned that Tim's doing a session after this, and he's going to be talking in more detail about how we set the pass mark and ensuring that the assessments are set at the appropriate level and how we do that between sittings. So I'd recommend everybody to stay tuned for that and to listen intently.
Thanks, Zoe. Good plug there for Tim's session. So you mentioned trends. A different trend that we've seen, it continued over the last year, but we've seen it in previous years, is that candidates tend to perform better in FLK1 than they do on FLK2. Any thoughts on why?
Yeah, it's fair to say that pattern has continued. Candidates are doing less well on FLK2 than FLK1. We can only speculate, as we did last year, really, on the reason for it. It's likely a combination of factors. I think, as we said last year, FLK2 does contain more application topics. So that could be one reason. It's obviously the second assessment window that we see. It comes after FLK1. So it could be that there's an element of tiredness or how people focus their revision attempts in the run up to the exams. What is interesting to point out, though, is that the differences that we saw between FLK1 and FLK2 did seem to reduce this year. So last year it was 2% different in Jan 24, 5% difference in July. They were down from 3% and 8% the previous year, respectively. So maybe we might continue to see a closing of that gap in future years, perhaps as people become more aware of those differences and perhaps seek to make changes in their revision and study patterns to compensate for that.
Thanks, Zoe. And another continuing trend has been that the pass rates for candidates who are resitting an assessment, that's continued to be lower than those sitting for the first time. Any thoughts, any advice on why that might be?
Yeah, again, unfortunately, we have seen this trend continuing in 24, and on the screen now we've broken down and extracted that information from the annual reports for viewers here. So yeah, you can see that the pass rates in both January and July were significantly lower for resitting candidates compared to those on their first attempt. And that's particularly the case for someone who's in the unfortunate position of having to resit both FLK1 and FLK2. First attempt overall pass rates in January and July 24 were 59% and 48% respectively, whereas for the resit candidates, much lower at 16% and 21%. So it's worth highlighting, actually, that if we look specifically at the movement from January to July, so 29% of candidates who failed part or all of SQE1 in January went on to resit at the next available sitting in July 24. And if we focus on those candidates specifically, their pass rate was particularly low. So in terms of advice, Julie, I'd really just encourage candidates to ensure that they've got sufficient time ahead of their resit to dedicate to their further study in order to improve their marks. Now, we give candidates the detailed breakdown now of their marks to help them identify the areas that they perhaps need to invest a bit more time in, where they could do with improving. But another piece of advice that I'd give, and this is from years of being in a training provider position, is make sure you don't neglect the areas that you did better on originally, because there's obviously quite a bit of time that lapses in that intervening period. And so it may well be the case that candidates forget some items, even in the areas that they were quite strong on previously. So yeah, that would be my only other piece of advice, really. There are other general trends in the annual report, as usual. So that's got information about performance of candidates in general in different practice areas. I think that's in section 5 of the report. So probably worthwhile having a good look at that if you are in the unfortunate position of having to resit the exam.
Thanks, Zoe. So we've covered quite a lot on SQE1. Can we move to SQE2 now?
Yeah, no problem. So this year's report contains information on 5 SQE2 sittings. That was just because we were realigning to try and give more up-to-date information within the annual reports. For next annual report, it will be back to the standard 4. So since the report was published, though, we've also had candidates sit and receive results for the October 24 exams. So just to keep things as up to date as possible, I'm going to focus on just the sittings that took place in 2024. And you've got on screen there the pass marks and pass rates for those sittings. So the pass rates continue to be markedly higher than for SQE1, and as we've said previously, that is absolutely to be expected given the eligibility requirement to have a qualification level functioning legal knowledge in order to sit and attempt SQE2. For the first time, we saw a pass rate of just over 80% in the most recent sitting in October that we've released results for. So similar to what I was saying about SQE1, pass marks and pass rates, nothing's predetermined. This one's operating in the other direction, so more candidates than usual met the standard and therefore passed. But again, we're comfortable that that standard was set at the right level. And it's going to remain to be seen whether this is a trend that will emerge over time across the pattern of sittings. We see similar patterns to SQE1 in terms of first-time sitters performing much better than resitters. And the annual report's got loads of information in there about candidate performance by practice area and by the particular skills that we're focusing on. It's maybe also worth highlighting that the annual report contains a section on ethics, actually covering both SQE1 and SQE2. I know that's an area the profession has a particular keen interest on at the moment, given the LSB's consultation around professional ethics. So for those of you that aren't familiar with how ethics and professional conduct are examined in the SQE, you can find out more in the report. I think that's section 6. We've got data on candidate performance on ethics and professional conduct in S1 that is showing generally candidates perform very well in that area when compared to sort of other areas. And there's typically a very strong correlation between performance in ethics and professional conduct questions and overall performance on the exam.
Thanks, Zoe. So lots of information in the report if you want to see that. Can we turn to how results are presented to candidates? Scaled scores are going to be introduced for SQE2 this year. Can you tell us more, please?
Yeah, of course. So as we announced in December last year, we're going to be introducing SQE2 scaled scores this year. It's going to apply first to those who sat the exam in January 2025. Scaled scores are routinely used in high stakes professional assessments, so medicine, accountancy, the New York State Bar, for example. And we introduced scaled scoring in SQE1 last year, and are bringing it in for SQE2 in order to match that approach. Basically, it means candidate scores will be placed on a common scale, and that will enable easier comparison between those taking the exam, both within an assessment window and also between assessment windows over time.
Thanks, but it doesn't change the assessment. It doesn't change the standard required to pass. It will, of course, change what candidates see on their results page. Can you explain what they will see?
Of course, yeah, that's absolutely right. An important point to make, Julie, thank you. We're still marking this in exactly the same way, in line with Section 2 of the Marking and Standard Setting Policy. There's no change to the way the SQE is being assessed or marked. So at the moment, if two candidates with the same ability take different assessments, their marks might differ because of the difficulty of the assessment itself. Converting the marks into that scaled score allows the scores across all assessments to be compared, and therefore accounts for any differences. So it means that comparison is easier. And as we mentioned in the news item we published in December, the changes that the candidates are going to see on their results page are actually relatively small. We've actually just finalised a video about the differences. So rather than me going into lots of detail on that, maybe it's easiest that we just play the video and that can sort of show people in a little bit more detail what they're actually going to see.
Viewing your SQE2 results. To find your results, log into your SQE account by entering your username and password, clicking the Login button. You'll then see the SQE overview page. Scroll down to the section labelled Get Your Results. Click on Show Details and then view your results. You can also access these by choosing the Results tab on the right-hand side of the page. On the Results page, you will see your score as a scaled score and percentage. The scaled score will be out of 500 and the passing score is always 300. It will also show if you have passed or not. There is also a detailed breakdown of your marks. For those resitting SQE2, you can see your earlier results by clicking on View Previous Results. Depending on when you previously took the assessment, your results may only show as a percentage score out of 100.
So that's a little video that will be available on the website along with other information, and it will be there before the first candidates receive their SQE2 results in a scaled way. Now, of course, it was the introduction of scaled scores for SQE1 that was taken last January that led to the results issue. Zoe, we did say we'll return to this, so it does seem to be a timely point to come back to that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a good idea. So yeah, I mean, unfortunately, during the reporting period, we did have the results issue for the January 24 SQE1 assessments. As you mentioned, Julie, 175 candidates who were originally told that they had failed either FLK1 and or FLK2 did in fact pass those assessments. The incorrect results arose not as a marking error, not as a calculation error, but because the results calculation process that we used did not round the scores at the point that was set out in the published marking and standard setting policy. So no errors in the marking, no instances of changes to the number of correct answers or anything like that. And it was unique to that sitting because of the introduction of scaled scores that required that additional element of calculation. As I'm sure a lot of people know already, we contacted all the candidates involved who were impacted to apologise and extend those apologies, still now. We worked to support those affected, taking various steps as best as we could to minimise the impact of the issue on them. So depending on different candidate circumstances, we gave them priority and choice about when they wanted to sit SQE2 for those that could continue. We refunded exam fees, we reimbursed expenses and provided compensation. We held various stakeholder meetings to let them know what had happened and to ensure that they had full information, so training providers, for example, so that they were able to help support candidates who were affected by it. You mentioned earlier, Julie, about giving a bit of an update on what we've done to uncover what happened and importantly how we make sure it doesn't happen again, particularly with the introduction of scale scores for SQE2. So we carried out internal investigations straight away, but we also appointed an external expert reviewer A lady called Anne Pino de Moira, a chartered statistician. She's worked in the field of assessments for more than 25 years. And Anne conducted a two-phased review. The first thing she did was did a recalculation of the results that we issued, or we reissued, to give assurance to everybody, every candidate that sat then, that they had now got the right results. And the outcome of that first review was published in May, so shortly after the re-release, and that confirmed that everything was accurate and correct. The second part of Anne's review concluded in July, and we asked her to look at the contributing factors and what we could do to prevent it happening again in the future. And Anne identified areas of recommendations relating to change management, effectiveness and alignment of the policies and the processes, some aspects around clarity of roles and responsibilities, and the way we communicate between the teams. And so we took her recommendations and created an action plan to implement those and to extend the learnings from that review to wider business practices. We've been delivering against that action plan, providing reports through to yourself, Julie, and others at the SRA on a regular basis. And I'm pleased to say the majority of those actions, the vast majority, have now been completed, including the update to the marking and standard setting policy and the associated processes there, which is really how we have assurance that this is not going to repeat itself when we introduce scale scores for SQE2.
Thanks, Zoe. It was obviously a really unsettling time for those candidates who were affected, and we need to assure those that will be receiving their SQE2 results using scale scores for the first time that those lessons have been learned. So we're almost coming out of up to time. We need to pass over to Tim shortly, but anything you'd just like to finish on in terms of what we've got to look forward to, what you're working on now for the year ahead?
Yeah, I'll be very quick. I am conscious of time. So anonymised reports for training providers, as we promised last year, we've extended that through to SQE2, and we're now producing annual reports to those training providers that have got sufficient learners to ensure that an individual candidate can't be identified. They will be getting those reports on an annual basis, and that will really help to drive improvements in training provision and address the sort of the practice areas where candidates perhaps don't perform as well. We've brought a new oral test centre online in London. We are now running assessments as well out of the Royal College of Surgeons location in Holborn. And that's to meet the increased demand for those sitting in London. And then finally, I mentioned reasonable adjustments earlier on. So last year we made mention of a project to look at for a smoother process for candidates requesting reasonable adjustments and the booking of assessments. We've been working on a new application form and process that will bring some significant improvements to that journey. That will be released shortly in the next few months, and more information will be available later in the spring, including update to the website and either a live webinar or a video that we will release to demonstrate to training providers and candidates what the changes are and how that's going to be an improvement for them.
Thanks, Zoe. And again, I think you've trailed some of these activities in the annual report, and a reminder to everybody that it's there for everybody to read if you haven't already. Okay, thank you, Zoe. We'll see you again when we get to the question section, but I'm now going to ask Tim Madison, Legal Academic Director at Kaplan, to join us to take us through how standards are set for SQE1. Tim, so welcome. Zoe did talk a little bit about the difference in pass rates that we saw in last year's assessments, and she did tell us that you would explain more about how the pass mark is set. So over to you, and a reminder, because I know this is going to be a little bit technical in places, that everybody participating will be able to rewind and hear the session again and look at any slides too. So over to you, Tim. Thank you.
Thanks, Julie. Yes, and I will do my very best to explain this in a straightforward manner as possible. But as I say, as you said, there are some technicalities, but I will do my very best to explain it in a straightforward way. And it also goes to Ricardo's point earlier about assessment literacy and trying to make sure that candidates are able to understand how we go about setting our pass mark and maintain standards. The focus here is on SQE1 rather than SQE2. The reason for that being is that the majority of the feedback that we do get from candidates and other stakeholders about wanting to understand a little bit more about our standards and our pass marks relates to SQE1. So that's why the focus is more on SQE1 in this section. The other thing to mention before I get into it is that we do use multiple papers for SQ1 in each delivery. And so when we talk about setting the pass mark is set independently for each of those papers. So it's important to flag that. And as Zoe mentioned earlier, the papers that we produce, we are aiming, of course, for them to be equally challenging, but it is inevitable that there will be some small variations in the difficulty of those papers. And that's where our approach comes in. So where we do have evidence that a particular paper is more difficult or easier than the others, the pass mark will be reflected to ensure that that difficulty or easiness is ironed out. So we don't have a predetermined pass mark for our SQ1 papers. We don't use a historical precedent pass mark of, say, 50% that would apply to all the papers. That wouldn't represent a fair approach and not one that's in line with best practice either. So for SQ1, as I've mentioned, the pass mark is adjusted to reflect the difficulty of each of those papers.
Thanks, Tim. So that's the overview. So how exactly is the pass mark determined?
Thanks, Julie. Yeah, so it's not a straightforward process. There are, because we are looking at the difficulty of each paper and setting the pass mark accordingly, there are a number of steps and processes that have to be undertaken to enable us to do that. The pass marks are determined in accordance with the standard setting and marking policy. So it makes sense when I go through how we determine the pass mark that we refer to the relevant parts of that policy. And as I said, I will be aiming to do this in as straightforward way as possible. So for SQ1, the policy is essentially split into two parts. So the first part deals with the candidate score. So that's paragraph 1.2 that we can see there. And this is relatively straightforward. So each correctly answered question will receive 1 mark. There's no negative marking, and so the number of marks that the candidate gets are added together to provide the overall score for that candidate for that particular assessment. So, for example, a candidate may get 114 questions correct out of the 180 available for a particular FLK assessment, and that's what we call the raw score. So the candidate does actually see that score on their results portal as well. So that's the candidate score. If we move on then to think about how the pass mark is determined, then so this is a little bit more involved. So I'll go through it in hopefully a methodical way. I should point out at the start that the pass mark that's considered by the assessment board and ultimately approved by the assessment board is presented as the number of correctly answered questions required to pass the assessment. So you can see on the slide there that we've got an example where pass mark may be 105 out of 180 correctly answered questions, and that's what would be required to pass. Scale scoring has already been touched upon, and I will mention this right at the end as well, but the pass mark presented to candidates will always be presented as a figure of 300, and I'll touch more on that right at the end of this particular session. So let's have a look through then and see how the pass mark is determined. So paragraph 1.3 of the policy refers to the fact that a cut score for an assessment will be determined by the assessment board, having reference to the standard determined by the modified Angoff method, any other recognised standard setting methods as appropriate, as well as statistical equating. So we'll come back to the cut score a bit later on, but essentially what the cut score is it's referring to the lowest possible score to pass an assessment, so the lowest possible pass mark. As we'll see later on, that doesn't necessarily mean that that would be the actual pass mark, it's just that lowest possible pass mark. It's also probably important to mention at this point that the policy refers to more than one standard setting method. You can see that in those first two sub-bullets on the slide there. To date, the Angoff method has been the primary standard setting method for SQE1. However, with any form of standard setting, it's essential each and every time to conduct an evaluation of the standard produced by that particular method each time it's used. So essentially what that means is we need to check that it's worked and produced a sensible and a reasonable result. And so it's unwise to restrict any assessment board to only being able to make a decision on a pass mark based on one method alone. So that approach hopefully makes sense, but it's certainly supported in the literature as being good practice. But it is the modified Angoff method that's the primary underlying standard setting method used for SQE1.
So, Tim, given that Angoff or modified Angoff is so central to the way the pass mark is set, could you tell us a bit more about how that works?
Sure. So first and foremost, the key to any defensible and acceptable pass mark is the implementation of a very careful, systematic method that's based on research evidence and that's supported in literature as well. And so the Angoff method is one, if not the most commonly used standard setting method for this type of assessment in a high stakes setting. And paragraph 1.4 of the policy gives a little bit more detail about how the Angoff method works. If I could summarize, it involves, it's a legal assessment for prospective solicitors, so it involves a panel of qualified solicitors who are familiar with day one competence, and that panel considers for each question in an assessment how many out of 10 just competent day one solicitors would answer the question correctly. So essentially that panel is looking at how difficult each of those questions are. The panel itself is carefully selected in terms of its diversity, and by that I mean in terms of the background of each individual panelist, their level of qualification. So we're keen to make sure we've got a real spread in terms of that level of qualification. Also in terms of practice area and in terms of whether the panelists are actually in practice, so some of them will be in practice, but some of them will be non-practicing. For example, they may well be in higher legal education. And the panel undergoes quite rigorous training before they submit their scores, so they're quite clear on the process and the task that they have to undertake. And so the panelists submit their scores and they're recorded, and there's an opportunity for discussion. So, for example, there may be a few panelists that provide much higher or much lower scores than the rest of the panel. And so there's an opportunity for everyone to discuss the different scoring, give the justification for that scoring, and if and only if the panelists deem it appropriate after that discussion, the opportunity to adjust their scores. And once they've put their scores in, the average score of each question is used, and then we'll see in a moment that that's used to determine what we refer to as the cut score. So you're going to see on the next slide here a small example as to how that method works. So this is a fictitious example. You can see on the left-hand side there, in the pink column, we've got 10 questions. So we can assume this is an assessment of 10 questions. And on the top there, you can see in blue, we've got 15 examiners. So these are our panelists from A through to O. And you can see what they've done here is that, let's take question 1, for example. Each of the panelists has given that question a score. So that's number out of 10 just competent day one solicitors, how many would get the question right. So for question 1, you can see the scores range from 1 through to 4. So the panel think question 1 is quite a difficult question. And that's reflected in the average or the mean score for that question. So if we keep going along to the right to the green section, you can see there's a column which is entitled mean, and the mean score for question 1 there is 2.3. So that's coming out as quite a difficult question. I won't go through each and every question, but question 2, you can see the mean score for that one is 6.5. So the panel have deemed that one not quite so difficult, slightly more on the easier side. And so that process goes on for all of the 10 questions for this particular assessment. And each of those questions then gets that average or mean score. And those mean scores are added together, divided by the number of questions, and then converted into a percentage in this case here. So you can see it, the little red box at the bottom there, that is what we have determined would be the cut score then for this assessment. expressed as a percentage. I did mention earlier on that the assessment board for SQE1 determines a pass mark, which is the number of correctly answered questions. So that percentage can easily be converted into that number of correctly answered questions. So that's the Angoff panel and the process and how we get that cut score in a nutshell.
Thanks, Tim. And I think it's really important to everybody to take away that it is solicitors who are familiar with what is expected of a day one solicitor and their level of competence that is at the heart of the standard setting process here. But the standard setting and marking policy also refers to statistical equating. Can you help with us an understanding of statistical equating and how it's used for SQE1, please, Tim?
Sure. Yeah, so you're quite right. Paragraph 1.3 there, which we've looked at earlier, also refers to statistical equating. And just to add, there's a further paragraph in the policy, it's paragraph 1.5, which also explains that the standard setting process, so the modified Angoff method that we've just looked at, is repeated periodically. And in between times, the standard of the assessment is maintained using statistical equating. So it might be helpful for me to explain that in a little bit more detail. So essentially, once we have a pass mark set using the Angoff method, we have what we might refer to as a base standard, a pass mark that's determined by that recognized standard setting method for each paper that's being delivered. But we don't necessarily need to conduct that Angoff panel for each and every assessment, and that's where the statistical equating comes in. And what the equating allows for is that comparison of the difficulty of different assessments by considering how candidates perform on common or the same questions in those different assessments. So equating is actually quite a complex statistical procedure, but I'm going to attempt to explain the real basics of how equating works on the next slide. So here you can see we've got an example of two tests. We've got test A and test B. And those tests have a number of common questions. So each test has a proportion of questions that are the same. And then when they're delivered, you can see test A, the candidates score 50% on those common questions and have scored 55% on the other questions in that test. Then a different test, test B, we can see there that the candidates have also scored 50% on the common questions and have then scored 45% on the other non-common questions in that test. And so you can see that as the candidates for test A and test B have both scored 50% on those common questions, we can conclude that those candidates for each of those, taking each of those different tests, are of a very similar ability. But given the fact that the test B candidates have scored lower on the other questions in that test, we can conclude that test B is the more difficult test, and therefore what equating allows for is a lower pass mark to be set for test B. And so we can maybe put this into a little bit more context. The pass mark set for test A could have been set using that underlying Angoff method that I've talked through already. And then test B could take place at a later date, so maybe 6 months later, for example, as is the case with SQE1 assessment windows. And so the assessment board is able to use the equating as a method to ensure that the pass mark for test B not only reflects the difficulty of the paper, but also ensures that the standard is maintained over time. So in other words, it shouldn't matter to candidates which assessment they take, whether they take test A or test B, the overall level of performance required to pass each of those tests is the same. And that's what Zoe alluded to earlier on as well. And again, also mentioned earlier on was the relatively low pass rate for the July 2024 SQE1 assessments when compared to other windows. And hopefully this shows you that the approach that we can take, so that's being able to look at the performance on the common questions in different assessments by different assessment cohorts, allows for that direct comparison of the strength of those cohorts and assurances that the standards have been maintained. So in that example, the assessment board was able to conclude that for the July 2024 cohort, they scored lower on a set of common items. So they were ultimately of a slightly lower ability than the January 2024 cohort. And that would therefore account for that lower pass rate that we saw.
Thanks, Tim. So, I mean, there's quite a lot that's already happened, but I think there are a few more steps to go through and before the final pass mark is determined.
That's correct, Julia. Thank you. So there's certainly one final step that's taken before the pass mark is determined. So once we have the cut score, so a reminder, the cut score is the lowest possible score to pass an assessment. At that point, the precision of the assessment, which is measured by the standard error of measurement, is considered by the assessment board. So the standard error of measurement is another statistical term or concept, and essentially tells us how much a candidate's score might vary if they were to take the same test on multiple occasions. And so it accounts for variation in factors such as the candidate's performance on the day, the specific questions that are used in that specific assessment, and even other environmental factors. So, for example, what happens if the candidate had a particularly good night's sleep compared to usual the night before the assessment. And so because of that measurement error, a candidate's observed score, so that's the score that they would achieve in that test, in that assessment, might not perfectly reflect their actual true ability as a result of the variables that can impact a candidate's performance on any particular day. And so in high stakes professional assessment, the interests of the consumer, so in the case of the SQE, the consumer of legal services, they're paramount. It's the same in medicine, for example, so the interests of a patient would be paramount in the medical profession. So it's really important that that measurement error is taken into account when determining the pass mark. And so it's common in high stakes professional assessments that there's a gateway into a profession to add a multiple of the standard error of measurement to the cut score, which in turn then helps reduce the risk of incorrect pass-fail decisions. What it really does is it ensures that those achieving a pass mark are absolutely competent to practice. And so to summarise, the pass mark, which we've determined now, or the assessment board would have determined, is made up of that cut score plus a multiple of the standard error of measurement.
Thanks, Tim. And then once approved by the assessment board, the pass marks for each paper are presented to candidates as a score out of 300. This takes us back to scaled scores that we were talking about for SQE2 earlier. Can you explain that step for us, please?
Yes, I can. I'll do it briefly, but there is plenty more guidance on the SQE website in relation to scaled scoring. And there's a really, really useful YouTube video as well that can be found easily online. But essentially, as there are multiple SQE1 papers, as I mentioned earlier, in each delivery, and they may well vary slightly in difficulty, it's difficult for candidates to be able to properly compare their score that they've achieved with the rest of their cohort, whether that's the cohort that within that assessment window or whether it's comparing themselves against previous cohorts. So, for example, a score of 105 on a difficult paper is better than a score of 105 on an easier paper. And so to allow an accurate and fair comparison of scores, the process of scaling sets all the pass marks to a figure of 300, with candidates seeing their scores, their scaled score being out of a total of 500. And so in the example I just gave, the candidate who scored 105 on the more difficult paper would have a higher scaled score than the candidate who scored 105 on the easier paper.
Thanks, Tim. You've covered a lot there. As you've set out, there's a lot to setting the pass mark. And sometimes we hear from candidates complaints, if you like, or questions about why they can't know immediately they finish their exam whether they've passed or not. I'm hoping that Tim's explanation of the many steps that are gone through to make sure that a pass mark that is fair and reflects the level of competence that we're looking for involves many steps and takes some time, inevitably. And we can't take shortcuts on that. So a lot covered, and a reminder that Tim's presentation can be watched again and the slides will be available. Okay, I did say that we would have time for questions, and that's where we are now. Thank you for the questions that have been coming in. I can see that quite a few of them will actually be picked up in the next session, the session that starts, I think is it 11:15? Those are about the candidate experience and the information that's available to support candidates prepare for the assessment. So we will defer those questions until then, and I think a lot of them will anyway be covered in the presentations in that session. But we have had a question about reasonable adjustments. Well, in fact, a number of questions. I think to summarise, the questions are asking whether we've got the right approach, whether we evaluate what's happening, whether we're making any changes. Some of those aspects we've picked up on. I'll ask Zoe to come in a minute, but Zoe, you've already sort of trailed the fact that some changes are going to be made to the process for applying for reasonable adjustment, and you flagged that this is an area of improvement that you want to make. Before I hand over to you, though, I think it's important to flag that we do look very, very carefully at the performance data for candidates across the whole range of protected characteristics. It's all published, and you'll be able to see, if you've looked at the data, that candidates who have either declared a disability and or had a reasonable adjustment have so far performed at least as well as candidates who have not declared a disability or who haven't had a reasonable adjustment. And it's interesting, this is one of the areas that we've been picking up in the additional meeting that Ricardo referred to earlier, when we're taking time to step back and look across series and look across what the data is showing us. We don't yet know whether it's suggesting that any changes should be being made, but as I say, it is very pleasing that, contrary to some concerns that we do hear from time to time, candidates who have declared a disability or who are having a reasonable adjustment are performing it at least as well as those who aren't. But Zoe, over to you on some of the changes that are being introduced, please.
Yeah, I think we're very aware of the fact that candidates who are requesting reasonable adjustments are going through additional processes in order to request those adjustments that other candidates aren't, and we want to make those processes as efficient as we possibly can. And we know this is an area that we're falling short on at the moment. So we, as I mentioned before, we have been working on a project. And that will be sort of released, the development work that's been underway, that will be released shortly, and that is going to significantly improve the process for candidates. One of the biggest areas of change will be for many candidates who require adjustments, it's to address a condition that is a sort of a fairly static condition that they have of disability or something that doesn't fluctuate over time. And we want to be able to give those candidates the opportunity to submit their appropriate evidence and background about that condition, and for us to then be able to sanction and authorise and agree with them what their adjustment is going to be, and for that then to apply to all of their future assessments, so they don't have to keep reapplying every single assessment window, which is what the situation is at the moment. So that's probably one of the main differences that we're ultimately going to see, and we'll be sharing information with candidates just as soon as we can in the next 2 or 3 months about how that is going to move forward.
Thanks, Zoe. The next question I'm going to ask Tim to take. The question is about whether the panel, this must be the Angoff panel that's assessing the difficulty of SQE1 questions, takes into account the fact that candidates will be answering them under time pressure.
Thanks. Yeah, it's a really good question, and it goes back to the sort of the Angoff panel process that I only briefly talked through, so it is a really good question. The panel goes through half a day of compulsory training before they can even start looking at the questions and submitting scores. You mentioned, Julie, that the panel will have that understanding of day one competence, and there's training and also discussion around that. But alongside that, the panel are told, but there's a discussion as well about the conditions under which the candidates are actually taking the assessment as well. So that's a long way to say yes to that question.
Thanks, Tim. We've had a question about SQE2 marking. marking and possibly standard setting, just trying to find the question there. I don't know, Zoe, Tim, could one of you take this for me, please?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, what's outlined in the marking and standard setting policy, for all the paragraph references that Tim's linked back to in his presentation, there's a similar whole section relating to SQE2 marking. We haven't ever really gone through it in that same level of detail that Tim's just gone through SQE1, but as he mentioned at the beginning, we tend to get more questions about SQE1 and why that takes the length of time to get the pass mark out, and perhaps comments in the press that suggestions that we just pick a number out of thin air or something like that, which hopefully now everybody is reassured that that is absolutely not the case. We tend not to get a similar sort of feedback from SQE2, but absolutely happy to go through a similar type of explanation at some point in the future on SQE2, whether that's at next year's conference, or we could look to do something sooner than that if there's a demand for it. Not a problem.
Thanks, Zoe. Yeah, something to note for next time, perhaps. Looking at other questions. Do we foresee any challenges as the number of candidate sittings scales up, whether there will be capacity challenges or changing journeys of those who are sitting? Touched on that to an extent at the start. Zoe, but is there anything you wanted to add?
I mean, yeah, I've covered SQE1 already, and we're not anticipating any changes. For SQE2, we do a combination of work to try and look at candidate demand and therefore the volume sitting. So we survey out to training providers 2 or 3 times a year to get their thoughts on how patterns might be changing. And then we also do a lot of data analysis on the patterns that we have seen. And we put those 2 things together to help predict what the volumes are going to be. And then we work very closely with our Pearson VUE partners for the SQE2 written exams, and then also our oral venue hosts to ensure that we've got sufficient capacity booked there. So that's how we approach it. We're not anticipating any challenges as such, because we have that process for forecasting, and that tells us where we are expecting to see peaks, and we're therefore able to ensure that we've got things in place to accommodate that. Like I said about bringing the new oral test centre on in London earlier on this year, it wasn't actually needed for when we brought it on October, but we knew it was going to be needed for this April. So we sort of predict well in advance and make sure that we make adjustments in plenty of time so that we are ready for when that peak does come.
Thanks, Zoe. I'm conscious we are 2 minutes over time, but there's one question that's come in, and it's specifically for Ricardo. So if we can perhaps just very quickly take this one, and then we'll need to close. And the question is whether the independent reviewer considered the geographic spread of test centres for SQE1 and the availability of SQE dates, and his view on whether these are appropriate. So just Ricardo, if I can ask you quickly to answer that one, please.
Sure. So the geographic spread of centers was actually something I queried quite early on, because I just wondered how were they determined. And in conversation with the candidate services team, I was assured that they're based on demand. So any areas that sort of may have more localized centers over others, it's because of where candidates request to take the tests. So it is aligned to demand. So I think the spread is justified there. And in terms of availability of SQE2 dates, I understand that I guess the increase in options is aligned with the increase in demand for the assessment, but there is also, I guess, some consideration of results timelines, and I think having too many dates sort of would have overlapping timelines, and also if candidates wish to retake assessments later on in the year, there needs to be adequate time for feedback, remediation, etc. So there is that balance of offering as many options as possible, but also having them so that they can sort of be delivered in a nicely packaged and having that time for results, feedback, etc. after. So I did have discussions about that as well too, and I do feel that the availability of dates within the calendar year is appropriate at this point in time.
Thank you, Ricardo, and thanks for dealing with that so quickly. Okay, we are over time, as I have said. I hope that a number of you will be joining us for the next session, which starts at 11:15, during which we're going to look a bit more at the candidate experience in particular. Hope you found that useful. A reminder again, the reports referred to are available on the website, as will the slides from today's session. Those we publish on our website, and a link to the session itself. Please, if you can, share your thoughts on the session with us using the feedback form. We would really appreciate your feedback to help us plan with for future events. So a reminder, the next session at 11:15, and then there's a session early this afternoon on qualifying work experience too. Hope to see a number of you shortly. Bye.